Hey everyone, in this video we're going to come back to our short series on little grammar lessons and talk about something called the locative case. So what we're really getting at is how you can express motion in place without using a preposition in Latin. Okay? And to start, we want to really come back and think about what did we do with prepositions, right? How did prepositional phrases work when we were trying to express relative location? So this is something you've seen before if you watched my video on prepositional phrases, but you want to remember that a preposition is just a word that expresses the relationship, right, between two words. So it's things like in, under, near, right? If you say I'm under the table, you're expressing a relationship between I, where I am, and the table, right? I'm under it, I'm beside it, I'm near it, I'm around it. These are all prepositions. When you stick a preposition with a noun, we call that a prepositional phrase, right? So instead of just near, on, under, it would be something like under the table or near the tree, right? Or if you want to get Disney on it, you could say under the sea, right? That was always a prepositional phrase when they were singing that song. So it's pretty straightforward and nothing too crazy. I know that you've probably heard this before, but we did in that video on prepositional phrases, I showed you that I usually use a house diagram in my classes, right? It's just one of the easier ways for me to kind of visualize this for my students. So if you're showing motion towards something or into something, we use the accusative case. If you're trying to show position or location and there's no motion involved, right? I'm in the house, you would use the ablative. Or if you're trying to show motion out of or away from, we'd also use the ablative. So again, if I'm going towards the house, accusative. If I'm in the house, ablative. If I'm away from the house, ablative. So this is important because you want to remember this relationship of kind of when we use the accusative and the ablative cases. All right? So you might be wondering, why are we talking about this again, right? What's the point or what's the catch? And the catch is this, and we kind of hit it on it at the beginning of the video. You don't actually need a preposition every time you're showing motion toward or away from something, right? Which might sound a little odd. But what we're specifically talking about are cities, towns, and small islands, right? And if you're wondering why it's small islands, it's because usually if the size we're talking about, it might only have like one town on it. So that's kind of why small islands get lumped into here. If you're wondering if that seems a little random, it's mostly cities and towns, okay? So when you're talking about a specific proper name, right, like Rome, you don't need the preposition. Right? Instead, you still use the accusative in the ablative case. We just don't use a preposition with them, right? So if you use the accusative case without a preposition, you're still expressing motion toward something, right? So if I want to say I'm going to Rome, I'm just going to end up saying Romam, right, which is the accusative case. And I'll show you more in a second. The ablative case without a preposition is used to show motion away from something. Okay? So the one that I left off in the diagram is how do we express motion in, right? Or express a place in something, in a city. What if I'm just in the city of Rome? This is where we use something called the locative case, which is an extra case that we haven't really seen so far. Maybe you've covered it in class, but I'll explain what it is as we go. Okay, so this actually makes some sense, right? You should be feeling pretty comfortable with it because of what we talked about with prepositional phrases, right? Even when we do use a preposition, if we're showing motion toward, we use the accusative. So now if you're talking about a city and you want to show motion towards a city or a small town, you still use the accusative case, right? Same with the ablative. We were always using it to express motion out of or away from something. That's the same idea here. We're just talking about a city or a small town, okay? So here's some examples. The accusative without a preposition. If you said Nasica Romam saipe ambulat, you're saying Nasica often walks to Rome. Notice how there's no preposition here. It's just Romam. Romam is accusative singular, right? Because Rome is a singular place. And the accusative is showing that I'm going towards it. So I translate that. It's almost as if the preposition odd were there, right? But we don't need it. So it's the same thing as saying like odd something, right? You just put the name Rome in the accusative case and you're expressing motion toward, right? So Romam means to Rome. And it works because I'm talking about a city, right? I have a proper name here. Here's another example, right? If we had the same sentence, Nasica Romam saipe ambulat, right? We just covered it. Look at the one below, Nasica ad casam parvam properat. This is what we're used to, right? Nasica hastens to the small house, right? Kasam Parwam is not the name of a city or a small town, so we use the preposition ad. So what you're seeing here is basically expressing the same idea. I'm either walking or hastening towards something, but in the top sentence, I'm talking about a city. I don't use a prepositional phrase. In the bottom sentence, I'm not talking about a city. I'm just talking about a house, a hut. So I need the preposition ad. Okay, so that's a good way of kind of seeing how these two things sort of flow together. Okay, here's the ablative. Okay, if you said Nasica Roma ad casam parvam properat, I'm saying Nasica hastens from Rome to the small house, right? Roma here with the long A is ablative. It's expressing I'm going out of or away from Rome. And we don't need a preposition because I'm talking about a city and I'm still using the ablative case. In the sentence below, I have something similar, right? Nasica e casa parva properat. I'm saying Nasica hastens out of the small house. Here, because I'm not talking about a city, right, or a town, I'm talking about a house, I need the preposition a, which means out of, right, a or x. So what I'm getting at here is it's expressing something similar, so it should feel pretty good, like, nothing too crazy to kind of think about, and it should make some sense. You're expressing a similar idea. It's just when you're talking about a city or a town, you don't need to use a prepositional phrase, right? That's the basic idea. But what about this locative case, right? You notice I didn't talk about it yet, and I didn't show how you can say that you're inside a city, right? That's where the locative comes in. So the locative is used to show place within which something happens, right? It doesn't use a prepositional phrase. And you can kind of hear in the name locative, you might recognize locus, which means a place. It has to do with like a place and where you are. This case is not overly used. I'd say in Latin, I mean, it shows up when you're talking about cities, but this is really the only time you're really going to see it in Latin. So it's kind of straightforward. If you memorize a few rules, you'll be able to figure this out pretty quickly. Okay? And even if you didn't know the locative case, I would say you'd probably still figure it out just by the context of the sentence. But here's the general idea. If you have a first or second declension noun, like Roma, right? If the name of your city is a first or second declension noun, the singular locative looks like the genitive singular. So either an AE or a long I. So for instance, if I'm trying to say I'm in Rome, I would say Romi with an AE, right? That would be my locative singular ending. It looks just like a genitive, which makes it a little confusing. Okay. The plural locative ending looks exactly like the ablative plural. So if I was talking about the name Athens, right, I would say Athenes with a long IS. That would mean I'm in Athens. Greek cities tend to have plural names because you're really talking about like the city and everything around it. If it's plural, use the ablative plural ending, which would be long IS. For third declension nouns, the locative singular looks like the ablative singular. So it's usually a short E, sometimes a long I, right, depending on what third declension noun you're looking at. But it's ablative singular, and the locative plural looks like the ablative plural. Okay? So if you think about it, we said that showing position or location in something, when you're dealing with a prepositional phrase, think of our house diagram, it uses the ablative ending. Okay? The locative and ablative are basically the same thing. The only time I would say it really gets tricky is when you have one of these first or second declension nouns and you use that AE ending or the long I ending, that genitive singular. That's the only time it really looks different. So even if you had no clue what the locative was and you just assumed it was going to be ablative, you'd probably get it right most of the time. Not all the time, but a lot of times you would get it right. Okay, the only problem is the most common city you're going to read about in a Latin textbook is Rome, and it's a first declension noun, so you're going to need that AE locative ending. Okay? So what do I mean? Well, if you have the word Rome, Roma, right? If I'm going from Rome, I use the ablative, Roma, with a long A. If I'm going to Rome, I use the accusative, Roma. If I'm trying to say, oh, someone is at Rome or in Rome, I use the locative Romi. And that's the ending that throws a lot of students off because it looks like it should be genitive of Rome, something like that. But that's not what it is. It's because I'm talking about a specific city or town, in this case a city, so I'm using that locative ending. Okay? Here's Athens, which is a plural city name, right? It's one city, but it's got a plural name. If I'm going from Athens, I use the ablative plural ending, Athenes. If I'm going to Athens, I use the accusative ending, right? Which would be Athenas, right? Plural accusative. And if I'm staying at Athens, I use the locative, which looks exactly like the ablative when you're talking about plural. So it's still Athenes. So this is what I mean where for a lot of cities, even if you confused ablative and locative, you're probably still going to get it pretty close. Okay? There's also a few special words that use the locative case, like domus, which means home, and rus, which means country, right? They're not the names of a city or town, but they still use locative forms, and they look like this, right? You have domo, which means from home, ablative. Domum would be the accusative, to home. Domi would mean at home. That's your locative ending, right? That long I. Same thing with Rus, right? The country, rure, from the country, Rus, to the country, and ruri, in the country, right, is locative. So it's something you just have to kind of be aware of, right, when you're dealing with these special words. But you'll be able to figure it out, right? They don't show up too often, and normally you'll catch it in a textbook or whatever you're reading. So here's some examples, all right? Let's just look at a few sentences and start to pick apart. Where do we see, names of cities or towns that aren't using prepositional phrases, okay? So if you said, Athenes est magna Minerva statua. Here you have Athenes. It's the name of a city, no prepositional phrase, right? There is no preposition. Because it's ablative or looks ablative, you're probably thinking it's either motion out of, right? Or maybe I'm in Athens. This case, because you're saying there is a big statue of Minerva, it wouldn't make sense to be ablative and showing motion away from, right? You're not saying there is a big statue of Minerva away from Athens. You're talking about in the city of Athens. This is the locative, right? It looks just like an ablative plural ending. You're saying in Athens, there is a large statue of Minerva, okay? Here we have Agricolae Athenis ad casas properant. Here we have Athenis again, exact same spelling, but it's expressing something different. I'm saying the farmers hasten to their cottages, okay? Their cottage or hut wouldn't be in the city of Athens. You're going out of the city of Athens, so it's ablative. So it looks just like the locative plural here because they use the same ending, but the context is telling you they're probably going from Athens, right? And because it's the name of a city, I do not need a preposition. You can just say Athenes, right? They hasten from Athens to their cottage. Here's another one. You have Nunc agricola uvas Romam portat. I have Romam, the name Rome. It's accusative. I'm saying to Rome. I'm expressing motion toward. So you're saying now the farmer carries grapes to Rome. I don't need a prepositional phrase. The accusative is giving you the idea that you're going toward Rome. Here we have Romae. Romae sunt multae tabernae. So this is a little tricky because the AE might look genitive of Rome, but you're saying there are many shops, right? It wouldn't make sense to be genitive. There are many shops of Rome. Nah, maybe in English it sounds kind of normal, but not in Latin. There's not more than one Rome, so it's not going to be nominative. You're trying to say in Rome, there are many shops. This is your locative singular ending. It looks exactly like a genitive singular, AE. So you're saying in Rome, there are many shops. Okay? So if we bring it all together and kind of recap, when you're expressing place without a preposition, right? What we're saying is you can do it when you're talking about a city, town, or a small island. You don't need a preposition to make a prepositional phrase. You use the accusative case without a preposition when you're expressing motion toward a city, town, or small island. The ablative case, again, no preposition, is when you're expressing motion away from a city, town, or small island. And the locative case, again, no preposition, is when you're trying to show location within a city, a town, or a small island, right? So if you're in Rome or in Athens or something like that. Okay, so this might sound a little weird. What I tell you is practice as much as you can, right? Use whatever resources you can to try to get experience looking at things like the locative, right? Or just not using a prepositional phrase. But the red flag is always when you're talking about a city, town, or a small island. That should catch your attention that you're probably not going to need a prepositional phrase. And again, think of what we learned about prepositional phrases. The house diagram, it still kind of applies here. You're following basically the same idea with the one tweak being this idea of the locative, which is not too bad to figure out. A little practice, you'll be fine. If you have any questions at all, put them in the comments below. I'd be happy to help you or answer anything that you have. But otherwise, hopefully this made sense. You're feeling pretty good about it. And the more you practice and read your Latin, the easier this will be. Good luck.